Okay, so what's going on with U.S. wages? I mean, that was England's wages post-industrialization. The Engels pause, and going back to the U.S., what is happening? So wages in the U.S. relative um, to England are almost across the board higher, and they've essentially always been higher, since the colonial era. That is because of the outside option, and so one of the main factors determining wages, back then and in the present, is what is your outside option. Um, when you're bargaining with your employer, it's like, you know, the biggest bargaining chip you can have is another offer um, at a certain, at a certain salary. And so, I mean, you see this with professor salaries. You can go and look at, actually, it's much harder these days. Back in the day, you can go and look up what, your professors make because they're technically government employees. So I tried recently though, it's more difficult. But back in the day, you use a database online, you can go look it up and you'll see some professors make, crazy money. Um, and the reason for that usually is there was a competing offer. You know, some other school was trying to steal the professor away. The professor says, "Look, Harvard's going to pay me 250K per year. What are you going to do?" That's sort of how you get higher wages. And in the present too. I mean, not in the present, but in many jobs, kind of playing employers against each other. Um, what is your outside option? People with low wages, typically there is no outside option. There's no other offer, which is why they accept the job with the low wages. In the US, in the 1700s, 1800s, the outside option was I can just go be a farmer. I could just go, there's plenty of land. I can just go become a farmer, and that's a pretty good, that's not by today's standard is not pretty good, but that's a decent living because of the ample land, the ample good land, and the liberal land policies. You kind of always have that outside option of moving to become a farmer, and so that pushes up urban wages. That pushes up wages because I have to pay you enough so that you don't, move and become a farmer. So the U.S. throughout its history has a higher standard of living than England because of the ample land. If we go back to the Malthusian world, essentially that land constraint is less binding in the U.S. And in this era, you have the frontier again, so you have that outside option, which is pushing wages up compared to England. In terms of wage growth, we see a lot of wage growth, which is what you would expect as the economy grows, as we have higher GDP per capita, higher productivity. But higher GDP per capita means higher productivity. That should be reflected in the wages. Usually, there's a tight relationship between wages and GDP per capita. Brief tangent: in recent years, since about 1980, that tight relationship between GDP, between productivity and wages, average wages or median wages, has kind of fallen apart. But once you add in other forms of compensation, health insurance, um, more sick days, more vacation days, 401k benefits, then that relationship remains pretty tight. Okay, so we have this relationship between productivity and wages. They're usually fairly correlated. So as the economy grows, we can see kind of big wage pickups here between 1820 and 1830, but they kind of stabilize between 50 and 60. There's not much growth if you look at this between 50 and 60 and across this time period. So we have a little bit. So when we're looking at U.S. wages, we see this growth, and then there's like stagnation, skill premium, which is the ratio of, in this case, we're going to use machinists to just regular day laborers, basically. The skill premium's going up. Okay. In many ways, this is sort of looking like the present, actually, where we have, wages for college educated people, or actually with advanced degrees, those wages are skyrocketing or going up, whereas kind of wages for high school workers are fairly stagnant. So you have this kind of growing gap between your skilled and unskilled labor. That's what's going on kind of in the 1850s and 1860s in the US as well. We have the skilled labor wages are skyrocketing, whereas the kind of average wages are staying pretty flat. So what kind of explains this? Well, supply and demand. So what happens is there's a massive influx of migrants in the middle of the 1800s. These are typically unskilled labor coming from Europe. And so what that does, the supply of labor. So again, for people who are not, familiar with these econ models, we could just talk about it in words. What's happening is you have the supply of labor is going up. So the demand for labor is going up. There's more industrialization, more factories opening up, more other types of business in urban centers. All of that is increasing the demand for labor. If you have this increased demand for labor, that's going to push wages up. All right. Because now, it's hard to find workers. I got to offer higher wages. I'm competing with a bunch of different employers. On the supply side, though, you have more and more workers. So the more workers you have, that's going to push wages down, because basically now the workers are competing. And so we kind of have both things going on. We have the supply of labor is going up as we have all these new migrants coming to the US. The demand of labor is going up, and they kind of cancel each other out. So we don't have much wage growth. On this side, though, for the skilled labor, the supply is not increasing by a lot. Most of the laborers coming to the U.S., most of the migrants coming to the U.S. are they don't have the in-demand skills. They're typically just common laborers, and so the demand for skilled labor is going up. This is like the present. The demand for skilled labor is, if you talk to anybody who works in tech, the biggest problem is finding workers. Like they just can't find workers with the skills that they need. This is like across the board. They just can't. It's impossible to find good workers. So the demand is going up, but the supply is not really going up. So what has to happen is the wages go up for skilled labor. Okay, whereas the unskilled labor is kind of staying. You have this demand shock here, not much of a supply shock, so we see an increase. But then from 1840 to 1860, the demand shock, the more workers coming, the supply shock, the more workers coming, that overrides the demand shock. And so we don't see much wage growth here, but we do see huge wage growth in the skilled market. Okay, so that basically describes the wage dynamics of the U.S. Throughout most of the 1800s, where we have higher wages than kind of the rest of the world, but we have this growing gap between skilled and unskilled that's primarily driven by migration. Um, okay, and again, that doesn't. We'll discuss the impact of immigration on wages next week more in detail. Okay. All right. So lastly, we want to look at the health outcomes. So one of the reasons why we don't see good life expectancy and good height data outcomes is just cities are very terrible places to live in the 1800s. So for most of human history, the city is going to be much more deadly than the countryside. In the present, that trend is reversed. People in the cities live longer than people in rural areas. And so what is happening is there are lots of public health investments that make cities more better places to live or less deadly places to live. But in this area, by 1900, the cities are still not good places to live. Okay, so the death rates are much higher in the cities, as you can kind of see from this table. Okay, but in the 20th century, as we move into the 20th century, we do see a decline in the death rates in the city because of these kind of public goods of water purification and sewage treatment that really were able to lower the death rates, make the cities much more, basically there weren't hotbeds for disease anymore. Okay, and we can see this by looking at a few case studies. So after they have the clean water, basically after they have the filtration, this is chlorination and filtration. So chlorinating the water, making the water less deadly, and filtering it, again, that's like taking the bacteria out of the water. And so you can see, after both these events, really typhoid fever mortality dropping in Baltimore. Cincinnati, it seems to be primarily driven by filtration is the one that really matters. And so we see these drops. Other work, so there's lots of different work on these like public health investments, and they're all basically showing the same thing in that, when you have these public health investments, that's when you really start to see the drop in mortality. Okay, so a similar study looking at Boston. So again, this study is looking for a natural experiment, and what they're looking at is towns that were, you know, hooked up to this sewage treatment thing, versus, you know, towns that weren't. And so again, you can kind of see the decline here. So the blue is the one that are they're essentially treated with the new public goods. Okay, and we can see there is a decline in both as like other improvements are being made, but you can really see the effect of that new sewage system, you know, by the time we get to the end of the period. Okay, and this is a really, I mean, basically, if you want to do a cost benefit analysis, um, these public goods, these making the cities, you know, safer to live is hugely beneficial. You know, and so this is like running water, running clean water is like one of the most overlooked inventions in human history. I mean, just having a flush toilet in your house and running water, that is huge improvement. Okay, all right, that'll do it this week. A little shorter week, but we'll get into a in-depth lecture next week on immigration.